And now we'll begin with the Q&A session. If you haven't already, please submit any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we'll do our very best to get to all of the questions if time allows. First off, someone asked Dr. Norsworthy, do we need to look at the forecast before we make Previsia herbicide applications to Previsia varieties? Dr. Norsworthy?
Dr. Harkey, I think my response to that would be, if I'm taking a look at PVL01, as I stated, it is definitely less tolerant than PVL02. I think where we have conditions of cloud cover, cool conditions with cloud cover associated with it, the risk is definitely going to be greater for PVL01. PVL02, it really doesn't scare me much. I think we've got good 2x tolerance there. When we do see injury, it appears to be extremely slight, and the PVL02 recovers rather quickly.
Thank you, Dr. Norsworthy. The next question we have is for Dr. Wamishi, and the question surrounds the best way to choose varieties that are best for your field history.
Well, the first thing is you have to know your field history. That is very important. Unless you know your field history, you cannot relate it with your variety. And particularly, this is important for blast. For example, if the variety is susceptible for blast, and if you plant it at a blast-prone area, then it is risky. So you have to be careful with that. And check out also the variety disease reaction table that we are providing every year. So every year that table is updated, and it is posted on Arkansas Row Crops blog, and also on Rice Information Fact Sheet. And the other thing is reach us, reach Jared or me, and tell us the story about your field, and we can help you with that too.
Thank you, Dr. Wamishi, and I will add that Dr. Wamishi conducts those disease evaluations across all commercial cultivars at approximately 15 locations annually to build that database. So again, a lot of production conditions encountered as she develops those ratings.
And just to add on that, there are field days in the areas of this prep or trial areas. So please try to attend those field days so that you can have some idea on the variety performance as well.
That would be when we can have those in person, but you will have opportunities to get with us, contact us about those locations, and we can at least get you directed to one of those locations nearest to you with your county agent, even though we may not be able to do the in-person field events that we typically try to. Thank you, Dr. Wamishi. The next question, not directed, I guess, Dr. Shakiba. When can we expect to see a hybrid cultivar released from the U of A breeding program?
Fortunately, our program placed new hybrid lines, experimental hybrid line in ARPT trial. And we are hoping that soon we will be able to put it in a URRN to make for further evaluation. So one of the important achievements I can say is to construct a pipeline for hybridized production. So you should hear, I hope, during these trials, ARPT and URRN trial, we will find a good lines that we can release as a hybrid rice. As Dr. Shaw mentioned also, that every year his hybrid and my hybrid that we are producing, we are going to evaluate them to see which one we are going for further evaluation.
Thank you, Dr. Shakiba. Yes. And as you stated, there are several hybrids in the advanced testing of the Arkansas Rice Performance Trials currently, which all fit typical Southern U.S. long grain quality. So everyone's, of course, excited about those, and hopefully one of the ones already in there will come on forward, but time will tell. The next question is for Dr. Roberts. When should I apply boot nitrogen applications to hybrid rice to see the milling yield increase you mentioned?
Jared, thank you for the question. I think when we're talking about, specifically that late boot nitrogen application, that late boot function of that is going to be very important. And so with any late season nitrogen application, especially to hybrid rice, I think you can go too early. And so we have not necessarily looked at different timings in this particular research project, but we have done that over the past about 10 years. And what we're really looking for is that boot split or that boot crack when we start to think about that late season application, because that's going to do the most in terms of increasing not only our grain yield, but our milling yield. Part of what you get into is if you go earlier than that, you can add some height to the hybrid rice cultivars that are not necessarily beneficial. But as far as timing, it's going to be that late boot. When we start to see those boots crack, we definitely want to get that late season application out on the hybrid rice.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. Pretty specific question for Dr. Shaw. The question is, how is the milling yield on links at lower moisture levels? Will it begin to break up like Titan can do when it gets below 14% moisture at harvest?
Yeah, Jim, you hear me? Thank you, Jared, for the answer. For the question. Anyway, based on what we saw in the ARPT, in all the trials we look at, it's going to be a improvement over Titan on the low harvest moisture contents, such as below 14%. I'm not going to say it's exactly like a Jupiter. I heard people complain about Jupiter as it never dried up, moisture never going down. That's the flip side on that, moisture never going down. They provide the stability on milling. So I say the link's not going to be like a Jupiter, but improve over Titan. On the clear-field medium grind CIMO4, it's more like a Jupiter. It's got a consistent milling, good milling, consistent milling. I'm not answering your question now. Thank you.
No, very good. Thank you, Dr. Shaw. Very good.
Uh-huh.
Another one for Dr. Norsworthy. Are there any new rice herbicide tolerant traits coming out in the near future besides the one you discussed?
Dr. Harkey, probably the two that I'm aware of that's in the pipeline, and when you talk pipeline, I'm not sure I'd use the term near future, but would be the HPPD tolerant rice. Couldn't tell you again how far that's off, but that is in the pipeline, as well as the fact, of course, the work that's occurred out in California in terms of trying to bring forth Roxy rice, which allows the use of oxyfluorophane within our rice. And both of those, really the key there is going to be going after weeds like weedy rice as well as barnyard grass, I think, being the focus. Now, oxyfluorophane also has a strong package in terms of some broadleafs, being a PPO herbicide, but I think both of those technologies could bring things to the table that would help us from a weed control standpoint if we can get them to market.
Very good. And I'll ask one more related question, Dr. Norsworthy, about any potential post-emergence herbicides for grass control in rice in the near future.
You know, in terms of things in the pipeline, Jared, I'm not aware of anything out there post-emergence other than what would be potentially coming with the new chemistry. Again, that being the HPPD chemistry that I just spoke about, as well as the Roxy. Those may be used post-emergence, and again, would have, I would expect, weedy rice control, barnyard grass control. But outside of that, I'm not aware of anything being the pipeline that's going to have what I would consider a highly effective control from a post-emergence standpoint.
Thank you, Dr. Norsworthy. For Dr. Roberts, what other nutrients could be a concern in terms of being mined by hybrid rice?
Thanks, Jared. When we're considering, other nutrients that potentially could be mined by hybrid rice. I think we really just want to focus on the ones that we typically see deficiencies in our rice production systems. And so I think obviously phosphorus, potassium, zinc, and sulfur are the ones that we want to focus on, just because they're typically can be limiting in our production systems. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that hybrid rice is not mining other nutrients from the soil. It's just that those are the nutrients that we typically have to actively manage to ensure that they're not limiting. And so to me, those are the ones we really need to focus on first, because if they are being mined, we're going to have to replace those through fertilization in order to keep or maintain our yield levels. And so really the ones that I'm most interested in them mining are going to be phosphorus, potassium, zinc, and sulfur.
Okay, Dr. Roberts, stay with me real quick. Got a kind of a related one on that topic. How can you identify zinc, phosphorus, and potassium deficiencies in row rice or furrow irrigated rice?
Okay, so in furrow irrigated rice, we all know that it grows a little bit differently than our traditionally delayed or direct seeded delayed flood rice or any flooded rice system. So the one thing that you'll notice in an upland or a furrow irrigated rice system is the lack of a permanent flood really alters or changes our nutrient cycling and our nutrient dynamics. So we'll start with potassium. Potassium deficiency identification is going to be essentially the same as it would in a flooded system. So you're going to want to look for those leaf margin firings on the lowest, oldest leaves first. When we move to deficiency ID for something like phosphorus and zinc, it's going to be much harder in a furrow irrigated rice system than it is a flooded system. So the one thing that you need to consider is the added stress from applying a flood to rice causes it to do things a little differently than it does in an upland system. And phosphorus, when we have moderate P deficiency in rice, it tends to turn a blue-green or a dark green color first. Well, a lot of times our furrow irrigated rice already has that type of color. And so when we're talking about phosphorus deficiency, it's going to be much harder to identify in that upland system. When we talk about zinc deficiency, zinc is critical for oxygen transport within the plant. And so that's why when we flood it, we often see rice plants crash or die very rapidly. When you're in that upland system, a lot of times you're going to have hidden hunger with zinc that's robbing your yield that you can't identify because you haven't applied that flood and really stressed the rice plant. And so unfortunately, I think in some of our furrow irrigated rice systems, tissue testing is going to be the only way to effectively identify potential deficiencies of phosphorus and zinc.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. One question that came in that I'll take a moment to tackle, asking about when will the Northeast Rice Research and Extension Center be completed? Very briefly, essentially the majority of the land leveling and preparation work for that site has been completed, and we do have some crops planted there currently, and we are hopeful that we can put the first actual rice research plots there in 2021 on a limited basis as we move forward with finishing the station out. Certainly the additional buildings or anything like that will be coming as we move forward over a period of time, but we're hopeful we can begin that research on a limited basis next year and build from there. So I just wanted to address that one real quick. On another topic, Dr. Roberts, still one other question your way, still on the boot nitrogen application for late planted hybrids. Doesn't say just how late, but on late planted hybrids, would you cut rates back any?
So when we're talking about late hybrids, I think, part of what we've got to understand is what we're essentially doing with the late planted hybrid is we're condensing that growing season. And I don't think we want to change those rates any, because when you're thinking about that late boot application, regardless of what your yield potential is. The physiological mechanism of what that nitrogen is doing in the plant is the same. And so essentially what it's doing is added nitrogen helps slow down reproductive growth, and it allows synchronization of our primary and secondary tillers on the plant. And all that together helps to increase that milling yield as well as the overall yield of the plant. And so even with late planted rice, we don't want to make any adjustments to that 30 units of N per acre for our late boot nitrogen application to hybrid rice.
Since we're on this boot nitrogen kick, this one was directed at me, Dr. Roberts, but obviously stay open to chime in. Commenting that we recommend roughly 60 pounds per acre of urea at the late boot application. Is this replacing the 100 pound per acre application that we've previously done? And how does this come into play with using Green Seeker? Very briefly, for 10, 12 or more years, we recommended the roughly 65 pound urea application at the later boot timing. That really hasn't changed. Our recent work, Dr. Roberts, focusing on, again, that remains true for current or newer hybrid cultivars. And I'll let Dr. Roberts chime in a little bit more on the Green Seeker aspect of that he's leading.
So specifically when we're talking about Green Seeker use in hybrid rice, the part where it's going to be most beneficial is making sure that pre-flood nitrogen application was adequate. So when we're using that Green Seeker, 3 to 4 weeks post-flood on hybrid rice cultivars or even pure line rice cultivars, our goal there is to make sure that we're not shorting that rice plant early in the season, when we're putting on tillers and putting on biomass to help push towards that late season yield. And so using the Green Seeker in hybrid rice specifically is really just to ensure that pre-flood nitrogen rate was adequate. And we can make adjustments, earlier in the season if we want to. The Green Seeker is not really used currently to make any adjustments for that late boot nitrogen application because we really need that late boot nitrogen application to help increase or maintain that yield and increase our milling quality. So the Green Seeker is really for pre-flood nitrogen adjustments, not late season nitrogen adjustments.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. The next question is for Dr. Norsworthy. Are you still looking at seed treatments in rice to safen for group 14 herbicides?
Dr. Harkey, we are. We're continuing to do that. Really excited about the progress that we're making there. We've been working closely with a company to help pursue that. And I can't talk in depth as to really where we are and what we've done, other than the fact that we are really excited about what we're seeing there. We've got some very positive results with our seed safening that we've conducted this year, similar to what we saw in 2019. Again, this has probably been now my 6th year of looking at chloracetamides and their use. And there's a lot of variability we see out there with it. One thing, and I'm talking about the use of chloracetamides and the activity they have on rice. One thing I would like to remind everyone here today, I try to reiterate this every time I talk about chloracetamides or group 14 herbicides. They are not labeled. They're not labeled for use in rice currently. So we need to be mindful of that. But we have some exciting research, and I'm optimistic that hopefully within the next maybe 2-3 years, we can work closer towards commercialization of some of these products.
Thank you, Dr. Norsworthy. Hang with me for a second in case I handle this one wrong, but the expectation for the hybrid version of Previsia, I'm sure they're asking about the Max Ace technology and when our expectation is that will be commercially available. My current expectation is commercial in 2 years.
I think that's realistic. That's kind of what I've heard. At one time there was some talk of maybe something out there next year, but I'm really believing we're looking at more like 2022 before we can really match the herbicide with the genetics and make sure we've got good tolerance.
Thank you. The next question I'll direct to, I guess both Dr. Shakiba and Dr. Shaw, either or both of you could chime in on this one. Are there any advantages to 2-line versus 3-line hybrids?
Well, if it's okay with Dr. Shaw, I would answer this question. Thank you for your question. Well, mainly the main difference is due to the breeding point of view. That means for developing hybridized through 3-line method, you need to develop 3 separate lines of male sterile or cytoplasmic male sterile, maintainer line, that is for propagation of sterile line, as well as restorer line that requires to have a restorer genes in their genome. So it would be able to fertile the combination of between male sterile and restorer line to produce the hybrid seeds. So that means a breeder needs to develop 3 different lines. But in the case of hybrid line production through 2 lines method, the job is much easier. That means you need to just develop a male sterile line that is influenced by certain environmental condition. And any types of cultivar or can be used as a pollen donor. So if Dr. Shaw would like to add something.
Yes, Dr. Shakiba is right. 2-line relatively much easier. Unlimited combination we can produce spring fall. 3-line you have to develop, especially restore line, which not exist in the U.S. rice gene pool. We have to do all the hard work. The one thing I guess is the 2-line, which more easily affected by the environment, especially the cold front, just like nice weather we experienced a couple of weeks ago and right now, which definitely going to adversely affect the purity of the seed. On the other hand, the 3-line, which is not affected by these kind of weather. So there's a trade-off, but anyway, thank you.
Thank you both, Dr. Shakiba and Dr. Shaw. Dr. Roberts, one more question for you. Sulfur deficiency a problem? How do we know?
Okay, so when we're talking about sulfur deficiency specifically, if you have a true sulfur deficiency, it's usually fairly obvious. You know, the plants are going to be stunted, overall yellow cast. A lot of times people think that it's can be confused with nitrogen deficiency. But typically when we have nitrogen deficiency, you know, those lower leaves are going to be very necrotic, very chlorotic. They're going to start to die first, where when we have sulfur deficiency, it's usually the newest leaves that are affected. If you ask my professional opinion, I think that the majority of the acreage we produce rice on, such as our silt loams and our heavy clay soils, we're not going to see a response to sulfur, or we're not going to see sulfur deficiencies. However, there are soils out there, especially our sandy soils or our clay soils, that do have sand layers underlying or sand streaks within them. That you definitely need sulfur for those particular soils. And so unfortunately, when you're in a very sandy field or a field that changes texture, you're definitely going to need to probably apply sulfur to address that and prevent a sulfur deficiency. But I do think that the vast majority of our rice acreage, we have an ample amount of soil organic matter to provide sulfur, and we're probably not going to see a benefit from a sulfur application. But there are definitely sandy spots and areas in clay textured fields where we have sand streaks that we do need sulfur to maximize yield and prevent deficiencies. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. I do have a question about related to if max ACE yields will be similar to Previsia rice yields, and I can answer that this is the first year we have a max ACE variety in testing. This would be the first year, so at the end of the year we will have some yield data relating it to Previsia varieties. We do not have in our hands yet any max ACE hybrids. So we won't have that comparison, but we'll have that single variety in comparison. So we'll be looking to do that at the end of the year. Sorry, one more that just popped up. We'll go ahead and try to squeeze in here real quick, and I will, I guess from variety testing, I guess I'll attempt to answer it. So what variety, CLL 15 or CLL 16, has the greater yield and which will perform better on a clay soil? And I'll chime in a little bit, and also Dr. Shaw, I'll then open it up to you. CLL 15 has arguably been our most consistent of the Clearfield varieties for the past few years, surpassing CL 151 in kind of that top end yield perspective, but also again being very, very consistent across soil types and growing conditions. Again, very short, semi-dwarf, very high milling yield. The CLL 16 has a trend toward higher yields than the CLL 15. So there can be some expectation that the 16 can have even higher grain yields, but it doesn't have as high of head rice milling yields as the CLL 15. Again, even though it's higher, it's maybe been a little less consistent, but it's never been low, but certainly maybe a little more variability there. And Dr. Shaw, if you care to chime in, anything to add there?
Yes, Jerry, I totally agree. CLL 15 is a semi-dwarf plant type. If you got straight levee stuff, CLL 16 was traditional Arkansas erect plant type, things like a diamond or Roy J. So you got a very excellent yield potential. But yes, that's pretty much what I have. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Shaw, great additional comment with the taller height of CLL 16, the kind of the more levees, better fit there with the taller plant type. So another nice opportunity there. Dr. Roberts, one more follow-up about sulfur real quick. Is there an ideal sulfur ppm, soil ppm we need to shoot for on our rice and soybean rotation?
So a question about, sulfur levels in our soil. I think, one problem with sulfur is it's very transient in nature. So we measure sulfur in our routine soil analysis. And since it's an anion in our soil, it's highly mobile. And so what that means is that we could measure it today, and if we get a big rain, or once we flood that soil, we can get a lot of downward movement of that sulfate out of the root zone. And so part of the problem with that is we can't, or we haven't done a lot of, or any correlation and calibration with soil test sulfur levels and rice response. I think ideally it would be nice to have at least 8 to 10 ppms of sulfate. I think that's a good indicator that you have the soil organic matter to produce the sulfate that the rice plant is going to need. But we don't have a correlation and a calibration for that. And that's why on the soil test report, it says a history of sulfur deficiency is part of what we're going off of to predict when and where sulfur is going to be needed. One thing that we're potentially going to look at going forward is actually looking at soil texture or estimated cation exchange capacity as an indicator of where we might expect sulfur deficiency for our cereal crops, rice and corn included.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roberts. And I'm afraid we're running out of time. We've reached 7:30, so I want to thank you for joining us today. Once more, I want to recognize the importance of the Rice Checkoff program. Thank you for your support of our research and extension programs. If you asked a question that we weren't able to get to, please visit uaex.edu or aaes.uark.edu to learn more, and don't hesitate to contact us directly. Thank you all for joining us for this first online field day event. If you enjoyed the program, our next field day is the online corn field day, 2 weeks from today on September 3rd. After that, our online soybean field day will be September 17th, and our online cotton field day on October 1st. Registration for these events is open now. If you'd like to watch any of these presentations again, please visit aaes.uark.edu/field-days to view the recordings. Thank you all and have a great evening.
Thank you for joining us for the Arkansas Rice Field Day online. We would like to thank the rice growers of Arkansas and the Arkansas Rice Research and Promotion Board for their support. This program was produced by the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture. To view recordings of these presentations, visit aaes.uark.edu/fielddays.